The candle breathes like a small star in the stone cell, its flame a patient tongue reading the edges of a cracked chronicle. Beyond the narrow window, winter presses its pale face to the glass. Inside, the room is a chamber of echoes. Dust, vellum, a wooden desk polished by a century of quiet hands. The book lies open to a year that does not sit where it should. Months drift out of their lanes. Saints' days appear before their births. A rain begins in a winter that arrived without autumn. The ink has browned to a soft earth color, and yet the numbers shine like tiny constellations, misaligned with the heavens that once guided them. It feels as if time, that ancient and sacred instrument, has slipped a tooth on its hidden gear, the clock that forgot to turn. Listen to the breath of the scribe. He is not a name in the book. He is an echo in its margins. His fingers move through the candle's halo, star-marked with flecks of soot, and the quill's feather, veiled in shadow, strokes a line across a date already written. Not correction, not quite. More like an ascent to a secret. In the scriptoria of those oceanic centuries, when empires had ebbed and roads grew over with grass, monks learned to copy more than words. They copied silence. They copied what did not speak, what was buried beneath what was said. Between two strokes of the quill, a year could be folded like a letter you never send. Between two tolls of a bell, a day could be unmade. And if you attend to the rhythm carefully, if you let your own heartbeat fall into that soft spiral, you can hear what they heard, the slow rearrangement of remembrance. Some scholars much later would speak gently of calendars, of the Julian sliding out of step with the sun, of the careful Gregorian hands that would nudge it back. Others would murmur about emperors and titles that glimmered like moonlight on water, real enough to touch, until you reached for them. Somewhere, a chronicle calls a King August, who left no footprint, and carved stones date an event to a winter that no star remembers. Not proof, perhaps, but breath. A trace on glass that vanishes as soon as you lean closer. In these pages, the dark ages are not truly dark, they are veiled. A lantern is held behind silk. You can see the light. You cannot swear where it comes from. Outside the cell, the corridor is lined with shelves, and on them, other books sleep like sealed gates. If you were to open them one by one, what might spill out? A scroll that places an eclipse on a day the sky did not consent to darken. A letter that greets an emperor whose seal exists only in imitation. A homily that names the feast as if it were anchored to a star, and yet the star has wandered. The monks were not conspirators in the harsh sense that the word now wears. They were gardeners of memory in a crumbled field, planting dates the way one sets stakes so vines can climb. They tended the past so that it would not fall apart in the wind. Perhaps that tending required a new trellis, a slight bending of branches. Perhaps it was never meant to be found. In the quiet undercroft, where the air smells of damp stone and history's sleep, an older book waits, its clasp a small bronze moon. When it opens, a thin breath of trapped centuries enters the room. The script is narrow and careful, the letters like footprints of a patient pilgrim. Here is a winter that arrives after 2 winters, a harvest counted twice, a coronation set to a sun that would not have been in that part of the sky. No one is lying. The scribe is aligning. He is holding the line of time with both hands and pulling it taut across a gap. To do this, he listens to bells, to the sacred roll of the liturgy, to the stars that are, and to the stars remembered. He listens to the swell of rumor, a war that never raged, a peace that never signed its name, and he writes the world as he believes it must have been for the soul to move safely through it. Somewhere far beyond these walls, a wooden church receives a stone doorway older than itself. An arch carved with leaves not native to the valley, placed without hurry between timbers that creak with newness. Architecture offers another echo. Roman bones beneath a medieval skin, a graft that heals so cleanly you cannot see the seam unless the moon is high and the frost makes the stone glitter. In a village nearby, a bell claims to have rung for a king no manuscript confirms. The bell is not arguing. It is singing the memory of hands that pulled its rope, the way a river sings its bends even after the water has moved on. This is the crux. Memory is oceanic. It keeps what it can, it smooths what it must, and sometimes it drifts, starless, until it finds a shore. In the chapter house, the abbot runs a finger down the calendar and pauses, not at a mistake, but at a kindness. Anno Domini, he reads, and the words feel like a warm cloak in a cold room. To live in the year of the Lord is to live in a circle of light, even if that light is thin. If a feast must be shifted to meet the moon's slow secrets, if an emperor must be placed to balance a genealogy that would otherwise fall, what is that, if not mercy toward time? We who come later see the stitch and call it a scar. They who stitched could only call it healing. At night, the astronomer among them climbs the small stair to the roof. He watches the sky the way a monk watches prayer. He has noted that certain eclipses recorded in the old lists do not land where the heavens insist they should. He does not accuse the past. He bows to it. He writes a small note in the margin. The stars remember. The ink dries. The candle gutters. A flake of ash drifts down and settles like a black snowflake on the 7 of a date that will haunt a scholar 400 years hence. There are pages in which a century seems to shrink like wool in hot water, felting into the next, and others where time swells like bread, the crumb light and airy, a decade making space for what needed to be kept. You may ask for a verdict: was time altered, invented, erased? But the room only answers with the soft ticking of the wick. The book answers by being a book, a gate you pass through in silence, a gate that was always open because someone chose to copy it open. The candle is low now. Wax lakes around the base and hardens in pale ripples, a frozen ocean in miniature. The scribe closes the chronicle with both hands, gently, as if laying a child to sleep. Outside, frost has traced delicate veils on the glass. Stars have drawn their clean lines across a sky that does not forget. Between one breath and the next, centuries tilt, and the clock, whatever clock has ever kept the true heart of history, hesitates, then continues, the pause so brief you would miss it unless you yourself were very still. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. Perhaps the dark ages were not darkness at all, but a long breath between psalms, a sacred rest marked by a monk's quiet hand. Perhaps an emperor existed as a prayer, a scaffold of meaning so the fragile bridge of memory would not collapse into the river below. Perhaps the stars forgive us our calendars, the way the ocean forgives a stone thrown into its immensity. The room empties of words. The last light leans across the desk, then lowers itself like a veil. If a century vanished, it did so as a candle goes out, surrendering its flame back to the night that carried it. We do not know, and tonight we do not need to know. The book cools, and the stone cell gathers its deeper hush. History breathes in, breathes out. In the space between those two breaths, sleep draws near and stands at the threshold. And you understand softly that time is a pilgrim too, and sometimes it rests, and sometimes it resumes, and sometimes, just for a moment, the clock forgets to turn. The hall is empty now. Only dust and light remain, drifting through cracked glass and over a throne that has forgotten its name. Once, this marble room echoed with footsteps that history insists belong to a king. Yet no crown remains. No portrait bears his face. The coins that once carried his name are pale imitations, struck, perhaps, for a ruler who never breathed. The story begins with a whisper in a library. A scholar, turning the brittle pages of an old chronicle, pauses at a line that should not exist. In the reign of Emperor Severan III, a name unrecorded elsewhere, the ink has faded, but the uncertainty glows. Was this a phantom ruler, or a necessary invention to fill the hollow between two reigns? The candles burn low as we drift deeper into that hollow. The century between empires feels less like a passage of time and more like a sigh, a space where the world waited for itself. The Roman world had fractured. Byzantium still breathed, but faintly. In monasteries perched on cold hills, the task of memory had fallen to trembling hands. Perhaps, to bridge the silence, they wrote of an emperor who never was, to give continuity to a crown that had lost its head. Some historians call it the phantom time hypothesis, a speculation born not of madness but of longing. What if 3 centuries between Charlemagne and the fall of Rome were illusions, inserted, adjusted, breathed into being by mistake or design? The thought feels heretical but also strangely merciful. For what is time but a fragile story we tell ourselves to hold the darkness apart? In that imagined empire, the banners still flutter in our minds. The roads stretch out, lined with broken statues whose eyes have weathered into blindness. Soldiers march, but their armor makes no sound. Inscriptions carry names that fade halfway through. The empire that never was seems more peaceful than those that were, for it cannot bleed, cannot decay, cannot ever fall. It exists in the stillness between history and myth, where the past sleeps like a sealed cathedral beneath the dust. Picture, now, a scribe in Aachen, his quill suspended over parchment. His duty is to record the reign of Charlemagne, yet the dates refuse to align. The stars he observes do not match those written in old Roman texts. To heal the wound, he invents a bridge, a handful of years, a name, a phantom monarch to cradle the calendar. When he finishes, he exhales softly. The ink shines like wet stone in candlelight, and the world feels whole again. We do not condemn him. We understand him. For in every age, humans fear the void, the unmeasured interval, the silence between notes. When we sense absence, we fill it with story. When we lose continuity, we give it a name. Sometimes that name wears a crown. Centuries later, travelers stumble upon his inscriptions, weathered and strange. They argue. Some say forgery, others call it faith. The air in those ruins is thick with the scent of wax and rain. The marble throne still stands, waiting for its occupant who never came. The silence there is not emptiness. It is reverence for the illusion that once gave comfort to frightened hearts. And so the legend of the absent emperor endures. In paintings that show a shadowed figure with no face. In songs that speak of a ruler who vanished before dawn. In the hearts of those who find beauty in the unproven. Perhaps he was real. Perhaps he was written into being. But as the night deepens and torches fade, we understand that it no longer matters. Because every civilization leaves a space for what cannot be verified. A chamber for the sacred uncertainty. The Egyptians left tombs for gods unseen. The Mayans carved calendars for suns that would never rise. The medieval monks, perhaps, wrote emperors into existence simply to remind the world that continuity was holy. When dawn finally slips across the cold marble floor, the hall seems less empty. Dust glows like gold. The throne no longer looks abandoned, only waiting. Waiting for the memory that will never return. For the ruler who never ruled. For the silence that once kept history alive. And as the candle burns out, we realize something gentle yet unsettling. Perhaps the emperor did exist, if not in flesh, then in faith. Perhaps his rule was not of armies and decrees, but of dreams, the quiet dominion of imagination that keeps time itself from collapsing. So the chronicles remain, the pages breathing faintly under the weight of centuries. And the question lingers like a lullaby at the edge of sleep. If history can create kings from silence, what other worlds might it dream when no one is watching? They say there was once a monastery hidden in the mist of a northern valley, a place where the world kept a different time. The bells there rang not by sun or moon, but by silence, and the monks measured their days by the breath of the wind that passed through their cloisters. To step inside its walls was to feel the hour dissolve. Candles burned neither faster nor slower, and seasons arrived like forgotten songs. Beyond its gates, the kingdoms of men rose and fell according to their chronicles. But here, time folded inward, like pages written over one another, blurring the centuries into something still and luminous. This is the story of the kingdom between calendars, a realm that existed in the space where time forgot to count. A legend tells of a traveler who reached the monastery after losing his way in the snow. He had crossed lands where calendars disagreed, where one town called it the year of our Lord 720 and another swore it was already 1000. He came seeking correction, but found only monks who smiled gently and said, "We no longer count the years. We listen to them." They showed him a chamber filled with sunbeams and dust motes, where an ancient astrolabe spun slowly under candlelight. Its rings were misaligned, each one marking constellations no longer known to the sky. "Here," said the prior, "the stars are not late or early. They return when they remember." The traveler stayed for 3 days or perhaps 3 centuries before leaving again, unable to say how long he had been there. In that quiet monastery, time was treated not as a line but as a prayer bead round, turning endlessly through fingers of faith. Every dawn began with a silence that felt older than sound itself. The monks would light their candles and walk barefoot across the cold stone, whispering blessings not for the day ahead, but for all days that had ever been or might be. In their scripture room, they kept 2 calendars side by side. One Roman, strict and measured, and another drawn by hand. A spiral of moons, rivers, and breaths. Between them was a blank space, a single white page where no date was written. They called it the day between. Some believed it was the day when time rested, when the world exhaled and creation listened. Centuries later, fragments of their records were found. Tablets half melted by damp, noting harvests that ripened before the season, eclipses that repeated twice in 1 year, and kings who ruled and died within the same month in different eras. Historians puzzled over the contradictions, but perhaps the monks were not mistaken. Perhaps they had glimpsed the breathing of time itself, contracting and expanding like the chest of a sleeping god. What if the missing centuries of the so-called Dark Ages were not lost at all, but lived differently, not measured by our reckoning, but by their own? In that kingdom between calendars, every second might have contained a lifetime, every lifetime only a second. Imagine walking through those cloisters under a dim blue dawn. Frost clings to the arches. Bells toll faintly, but their rhythm seems not of this world. You sense the presence of years layered atop one another. Yesterday beneath your feet, tomorrow hanging in the air, last century resting quietly on your shoulder. The world feels both ancient and unborn. You understand that the monks did not escape time. They became its guardians, its gentle keepers. They did not count it, they blessed it into stillness. One of their manuscripts speaks of a strange event, the day the sun rose twice. According to their testimony, dawn broke, faded, and broke again. Between the 2 mornings lay a silence so complete that even the birds refused to sing. They called it the breath of eternity. Some thought it was a vision. Others believed time had momentarily folded upon itself, allowing them to see both sides of its veil. Whatever it was, they did not fear it. They recorded it in gold ink, a line curling softly like a prayer. When the sun paused, we remembered the first light. When that monastery finally fell, abandoned after centuries of fog and isolation, travelers found its bells still swinging though no wind moved. The clocks on its walls had no hands, only circles of polished brass reflecting candlelight. And carved into the lintel of its ruined gate were words now barely legible. Time is a pilgrim, not a ruler. Those who read it swore the inscription shimmered as though written freshly each dawn. No one rebuilt the monastery. It was left as it had lived, suspended between ages belonging to none. Perhaps that was the kingdom between calendars. Not a place, but a mercy. A pause in the fevered ticking of civilization. A place where the past could breathe beside the future, and neither would harm the other. Perhaps it still exists somewhere in the folds of the earth, waiting for another traveler lost between years. And if one day you find yourself walking through a valley where your watch no longer beats in rhythm with your heart, where the sun seems reluctant to rise or fall, perhaps you have entered that sacred silence. Do not fear it. Sit upon the stone, close your eyes, and listen. You may hear the sound of centuries drifting like leaves upon water. You may feel that strange serenity that comes when time forgets your name. And when you open your eyes again, whether an hour or an age has passed, the world will look the same, but you will no longer rush through it. You will walk slower, as if remembering something older than time itself. For once you have touched the kingdom between calendars, every moment thereafter feels like eternity's breath. In the hour before dawn, when the cloister stones still hold the night's chill and the lamps burn like small, star-marked altars, the scriptorium wakes to its ancient ritual. Breath, quill, and the slow, sacred turning of pages that have already outlived kings. And in that breath, honeyed with wax and a thin tang of iron gall ink, begins the silence that the scribes learned to copy as faithfully as words, for these men of vellum and vigil were gardeners of memory, tending lines of letters like vines along a wall where history might cling. And if, in the medieval centuries we call dark, there were gaps and veils, it was not always malice but sometimes mercy that placed them, a quiet curating of what the fragile mind and the frightened age could bear. So the day stretches, candle to candle, as thin knives lift hair from calfskin and pumice smooths the crumbled grain, and you can hear it, the oceanic hush between scratch and pause, while a monk in hooded patience traces Carolingian. Minuscule, that soft, rounded hand born to bring clarity to tangled texts, and another, older scribe leans over a palimpsest where the ghost of a forbidden sermon waits beneath fresh ink like a buried city beneath a new cathedral. Here the world is measured by breaths, not bells, and the rule is simple and sacred. Write what saves, omit what burns. For they have seen flames take libraries as easily as wind takes leaves, at Jarrow and Lindisfarne, at Fulda and York, and they know the risk of naming names when emperors are transient and heresies multiply like stars after rain. Thus a line disappears, perhaps a ruler's boast that ages poorly, perhaps a date that no constellation will confirm, perhaps a violent chapter that only teaches violence. And in its place the scribe leaves a stillness like a narrow veil of snow over a field, not untruth, but rest, because sometimes the soul needs a pause more than a proclamation. You might say this is erasure, yet consider the other erasures. The Viking or cutting a wake through monastic shores, the pestilence that hollowed choir stalls, the accident of a guttering lamp, wax spilled, ember fallen. Against these, the scribe's silence is a small, deliberate kindness. And see how the margins breathe with life, tiny vines of interlace, beasts curled in spirals, stars sprinkled like flour over midnight. Silent hymns, yes, but also signs, reminders that the cosmos lives at the edge of every sentence, that the dust of creation falls upon the desk each morning. They copy Bede and Augustine, they soften stark chronicles with psalms, they thread Easter tables and lunar reckonings through the year so that feasts will find their rightful moon. Light factual anchors in an ocean of fear. Yet when a date bites the sky at the wrong angle, when an eclipse refuses to arrive where parchment predicts, a wise hand turns the page and writes the season instead of the number, the harvest instead of the day, the breath instead of the bell. For truth is not only arithmetic, and if a king commands a lineage that won't align, perhaps the scribe hums a plain chant and leaves a space where a name would trouble the peace, trusting that God knows the thread even when the loom snarls. All morning the room becomes a temple of tiny decisions. A dot spared, a flourish softened, an adjective gentled so it wounds no neighbor centuries hence, for the scribes understand that words are stones dropped into time's river, and the ripples arrive in villages unborn. At noon the light turns from silver to pale gold, and a novice is taught the sanctity of the rubric, the red that signals prayer and pause, and he learns that the red is not for spectacle but for breath, that silence has rubrics too. After the meal, a master corrector passes, finger to line, listening more than looking, and when he finds a broken chronology he does not force it straight like iron. He cups it like water, letting it find its own level, and writes a gloss in the margin. Some say otherwise. The gentlest way to place a lantern without blinding the night, toward evening, an illumination blooms. A gate of lapis and gold leaf where a gospel begins, and though the painter's brush is quiet, you feel the city behind that gate, the whole crumbled and sacred world pouring through the initial into the listening heart. Here the silence speaks most clearly, for the image is a constellation of the unsayable, the martyrdoms unrecorded lest soldiers return, the healings that no chronicler could catalogue without turning prayer into inventory, the small fidelities of widows and bakers and shepherds that hold the universe together in places where no emperor rules. And as the last candle gutters, the abbot lifts a book that cost a forest and a lifetime, and he closes it with both hands as if blessing a child, and in that gesture is the creed of the scribes. That not all truth is told at once, that some voices only echo when we are ready to listen, that a kept silence can be a chalice in which later ages will find water. Night unfolds, and the stars, those ancient, veiled accountants, take their measure of the cloister roof, and the monks chant Compline, leaving the scriptorium to its faint perfume of ink and leather. Yet even now the pages hum, for silence is not emptiness but resonance, the held note after the choir has stopped, the breath the world takes before the next word. And so, if you come to these centuries and hear less than you expected, do not think the record failed. Perhaps it succeeded at protecting the fragile, at letting light survive its passage through the storm. Perhaps it was never meant to be found, these gaps and rests, except by those who would sit long enough in the stone-cold quiet to feel time itself become gentle. For this is the secret liturgy of the scribes. Copy the sacred, veil what harms, align the years with the stars when the stars consent, and when they do not, bless the discrepancy and leave room for mercy. By such soft arts the world kept breathing between empires, and history, like a candle cupped in two careful hands, crossed the dark without going out. It began with a whisper among sailors, a rumor of a coastline that refused to stay where it was drawn. Maps had spoken of it for centuries, a silver curve of land between two known seas, marked by an ancient name that no longer belonged to any tongue. Yet when the explorers returned, their compasses swore the land had shifted, their bearings blurred as though the world itself had taken a breath and exhaled differently. The cartographers of old, those monastic keepers of shape and sea, gathered by candlelight and argued over their parchments. Some said storms had changed the world's bones, swallowing borders beneath new tides. Others whispered that the earth was rewriting itself, as if time's hand trembled and ink ran backward through history. In one dim chamber, a mapmaker named Edric pressed a quill to parchment, tracing coastlines that faded even as he drew them. The world, he murmured, no longer wishes to be seen. Each night he added what he remembered, but by morning the lines were gone. Rivers turned to blank vellum, cities swallowed by silence. He began to wonder whether the sea erased them, or whether he himself dreamed them into being. The legend of Edric's vanishing maps spread across kingdoms, and scholars traveled to his workshop to see the ghostly atlases. They found hundreds of pages covered only in faint salt stains, as if the ocean had breathed on them and left its mark. In the margins, he had written one line, "Here the world withdrew its face." Centuries later, historians uncovered fragments of those maps in a cathedral vault, their edges burned, their surfaces smooth as skin. When placed under candlelight, faint traces emerged, an outline of a vanished island, a river that looped into itself like a serpent devouring its tail. But every attempt to copy them failed. The copies turned blank, the ink refusing to hold the memory of what once was. Some said it was a curse, others said a mercy, for the lost land belonged to an age that never happened, a phantom time, a bridge between empires that history itself had erased to protect the living. There are stories that the sea remembers what the land forgets. Fishermen tell of ruins glimpsed beneath clear water, towers glinting like teeth in the deep. Sailors passing through fog claim to hear bells tolling from a drowned cathedral. And sometimes, in the calm before dawn, a shape appears on the horizon. An island where none should be, lit by a single flame, then gone before the light of day. Was it the lost kingdom that Edric mapped? Or merely the sea's reflection of our longing for what we have destroyed? The chronicles are silent. Only a few lines survive. Between the fifth tide and the sixth moon, the stars fall out of order. Astronomers have found no trace of such disorder, yet they, too, wonder whether the heavens once shifted to hide something not meant for eyes. Maps are promises, fragile attempts to fix the infinite. They tell us where we have been, but also what we have forgotten. The monks of Clonmacnoise once taught that every coastline is drawn in prayer, for the world is not measured by distance but by devotion. Perhaps that is why Edric's maps vanished, because they were drawn with too much faith, and faith has a way of undoing itself when it meets truth. Some say he burned them to protect the secret of an empire erased by decree. Others claim he went blind, tracing a horizon that no longer existed. Yet the simplest telling is this, that he drew the breath of the earth itself, and the earth, startled, drew it back. In the centuries that followed, cartographers avoided that region. They filled it with sea monsters, whirlpools, warnings. Here the waters remember. One inscription reads, "Sail no further, lest your name be forgotten." But curiosity is a tide that never retreats. Pilgrims, poets, and dreamers continued to search for that absent shore, not with compasses, but with questions. They said that whoever found it would find the missing years too, the centuries lost between empires, the phantom ages where time slept. None returned, or perhaps they did, but their words, like the maps, erased themselves upon speaking. Now, when you unfold an old world map, the kind drawn with trembling ink and soft edges, look closely at the spaces between the known lands. The blankness there is not error. It is memory. It is the silence left by the scribes who refused to name what the world chose to hide. The oceans are full of forgotten shapes, and the parchment still remembers their weight. If you listen, you may hear the rustle of waves against invisible shores. And in that hush you may feel what Edric felt, the quiet awe of realizing that not all knowledge is meant to endure. Perhaps maps, like souls, must sometimes be allowed to fade, to return to the great unwritten sea from which they came. For there is a kind of mercy in forgetting, and a strange peace in knowing that the world still keeps its secrets. When sleep finally takes you, imagine that lost coastline. Its sands pale as moonlight, its ruins breathing with tide and mist, and know that somewhere, beneath centuries of silence, the map still exists. Only now, it dreams itself in water, waiting to be redrawn by those who can see without needing to possess. They say the cathedral was older than the empire that built it and younger than the stones that shaped its bones. A star-marked vessel moored on a hill where winds braided prayers into the grass. To enter its nave was to feel time loosen its knots. Romanesque arches shouldering Gothic ribs, a Norman doorway haloed by a Baroque sunburst, capitals carved with vines that belonged to a climate the valley never knew, all of it veiled by dust the color of wheat and incense the color of evening. Masons spoke in chisels, and the walls learned their language, so that across the centuries the building kept 3 calendars at once. Lunar in its windows, solar in its shadow lines, liturgical in its breath. And if you stood very still at midwinter, the sun would climb the eastern haze and lay a blade of light along the nave, meant to strike an altar that was moved a lifetime ago, so that the golden beam now ends shy of the mark, a quiet error that glows like a saint who has forgotten his name. The guides insist the plan was altered after a fire, yet a scholar with a pocket compass and a notebook of stars observes that the axis itself seems faithful to a solstice that no longer lands when the rubric says it should, and in his margin he writes, "The stone keeps an older sky." The floor is a palimpsest of footsteps, but the most ancient inscription sits outside, where the wind eats it year by year, Anno Domini. The numerals dim, the century uncertain, a date that points both forward and back like a river's fork. Dendrochronology in the roof beams whispers 1 century, radiocarbon in the reliquary oak suggests another, and a charter copied by a careful scribe insists on a consecration that would require an archbishop long dead to bless it. The contradictions do not clang. They ring together like bells in mist, each tone an echo of an age that may or may not have happened. In the south aisle, a meridian line of pale marble slips across the flags, a thin oceanic stripe where noon is meant to draw its blade of sun through a high star window. Once a year, say the elders, the light falls perfectly, and the gnomon's shadow kisses a small brass star set into the stone. Yet pilgrims who wait with held breath find the light arriving a day late or early, as if the cathedral were faithful to a calendar no longer kept, the way an old monk keeps vigil by a rule his brethren have softened. Nearby, a painted saint points to a book whose letters are neither Latin nor Greek, a script that looks like wind written on water, and behind him a tower leans minutely toward a constellation that rose where no constellation now rises. Light factual anchors can be named, if gently. The old Julian count drifting from the sun, the Gregorian hands that nudged it back, Easter tables rethreaded through an age that feared the moon's reluctance, the way builders oriented churches to sunrise on a patron's day and then, under a slow sky, watched that sunrise wander. If you listen long enough, the contradictions become a psalm of time's mercy. The north transept houses a door whose lintel carries a procession of kings, yet one wears a crown unknown to the region. His coinage has never been found, his name survives like a breath on glass, and an archivist in a city far away has marked in tidy ink that no such sovereign ruled. The docents murmur that the sculpture is allegory, but a bell in the tower has a groove in its waist where a thick rope once bit deep, and records in a nearby village claim it rang for a coronation in the year between. A phrase no almanac understands. Sometimes at vespers the ringers swear the bronze remembers that day and trembles before the strike, then steadies, and the sound that pours over fields has the faint sorrow of a page removed. In the crypt, where damp gathers like a low cloud and a small spring keeps the air tasting of iron. The oldest stones lie face down, their prayers turned into the earth. A mason's mark repeats in 2 epochs 3 lifetimes apart, the same spiral carved with the same hand or with a hand taught by a ghost. A fragment of fresco shows a comet arcing over a city, and the marginal note beside it dates the omen to a year when astronomers say the heavens were clean. Perhaps the fresco remembers another sky, or perhaps the heaven we keep in records is only one draft of the celestial text. Either way, the curve of that painted fire has learned to live with the cool blue around it, and a pilgrim who kneels there comes away with the taste of ash and river and nothing he can prove. When the choir sings, the ribs of the vault become a vast thorax breathing, and the notes climb the stone in slow spirals, touching bosses that bloom with oak and grape, atom and whale, fish and star. The sound makes a kind of architecture inside the architecture, a second cathedral built of echo and held together by hush. In that sound you can believe that the missing years did not die but moved upstairs, into the music, to wait until calendars repent their certainty. Even the clocks in the sacristy seem to agree, their faces ancient and their hands removed long ago, brass circles reflecting candle flame like tiny moons, horologia that choose not to wound the hour. Outside, rain moves across the cemetery in thin veils, and the stones lean like weary listeners. One slab lists a birth in a year that the parish registers place beyond its death, a gentle impossibility left to weather back into sand. The groundskeeper shrugs, wipes his hands, and says the chisel was dull that day. Yet he, too, eyes the nave at midwinter and knows the light misses by a breath. When twilight gathers, swifts pour through the belfry like soot drawn into a bell glass, and the town begins to glow windows, hearths, a small storm of human constellations, while the hill keeps its old lamp. That nave of slow starlight, the organ's last chord sinking like a ship into the ocean of night. Perhaps no one lied. Perhaps many were kind. Perhaps the cathedral learned to be a bridge, a stone and sky omphalos laid where centuries meet and cannot bear each other's weight, so that it holds one in its south wall and one in its north, and lets them speak only through wind. You might long for a verdict, but the building prefers blessings. It blesses the wrong year charter for wanting to belong, the late sun for remembering once to be early, the nameless king for standing watch over peasants who needed a crowned face to kneel toward. And then, when all the doors are bolted and the last votive trembles itself to sleep, the hill grows very quiet, and the cathedral returns to its first vocation, to shelter breath. Under its crumbled, sacred vaults, the world inhales and exhales. The nave answers like a sea cave, and the missing years, if years can miss, lie down in the cool between stones, forgiven. You walk away softer. The road keeps its small mirrors of rain. Somewhere behind you, a bell that is not on any schedule thinks for a while, then decides to be silent. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen, and perhaps this is one of them. Perhaps it was never meant to be found. It began with the sky, or rather with something missing from it. For centuries, monks, sailors, and scholars had marked the heavens, patient witnesses to the turning of divine geometry. Yet, in one thin stretch of history, the records do not agree. A comet appears where none should. An eclipse is described by those who could not have seen it. Constellations shift, and the stars refuse to match their own reflections. The night sky, it seems, forgot its lines, and in that soft disorder, a quiet question began to stir. What if the heavens themselves were rewritten, just as the chronicles of men had been? In a monastery perched on a salt-white cliff, an old astronomer named Brother Alaric kept vigil over the tides of light. His instruments were simple, a brass astrolabe, a fragment of Roman parchment, and an hourglass whose sand he had ground himself from river stone. Night after night, he charted the stars, listening to their slow music. But one winter evening, he saw a pattern that should not have been there. A cluster near Orion, glowing faintly like breath on glass. He marked it carefully, naming it the Weeping Crown. The next night it was gone. He wrote it down anyway. Others laughed, until they too began to see what did not fit. In Spain, a monk of Córdoba recorded a wandering flame that spoke to no season. In Byzantium, a scribe noted a moon split in two, mirrored upon the sea. The fragments spread like pollen, small, shining inconsistencies drifting across the centuries. When historians of later ages compared them, the sky itself seemed to fracture. For each place and time, the heavens told a different story. And between those stories, an invisible century opened, a silence that no telescope could fill. Some now whisper that this was the moment time stumbled. The missing years, the gap between empires, left their imprint not only on parchment but on the cosmos. For if the chronicles of Earth were adjusted, then the heavens must have shifted to match. To alter history is to alter the sky. And so the phantom stars were born. Constellations belonging to no true season, comets that glided through the dark like lost memories, lights that burned only in the eyes of those who still believed the world had not forgotten them. Alaric continued his vigil long after the others stopped. He filled book after book with coordinates no chart could verify. Perhaps, he wrote, the stars are not moving, only we are. In the margins he drew spirals, each one a tiny orbit of thought. Time circling itself, truth folding inward. On the last page of his final journal he added, what if the heavens remember what the earth has chosen to forget? When the cathedral archives were opened centuries later, his journals were found sealed in wax. The ink still pale blue like frozen smoke. The drawings showed constellations no longer visible, patterns of connection too delicate for modern eyes. Astronomers dismissed them as errors of fatigue. But poets, reading by candlelight, heard something else. A sky that dreamed differently. A universe that had once exhaled in another rhythm. They began calling them the phantom stars. Remnants of an age that never was. Lights preserved in memory alone. On certain nights, sailors claimed to see them glimmer on the horizon, brief and shy as the reflection of lightning far away. They are the echoes of forgotten time, an old captain said. The afterimage of history's breath. There is one record, barely a whisper, of a mass held in Rome under a sky that did not correspond to any known alignment. The priests sang their hymns by moonlight that should not have existed. And when dawn came, the city's shadows fell in strange directions, as if the sun itself had misremembered where to rise. No one spoke of it again, but the church's astrolabe from that night still bears an engraving, Lux Erens, the wandering light. Perhaps, then, it was not only time that faltered but perception itself, the lens through which humanity watches the cosmos. The heavens may not have changed at all, only our calendars did. And when they slipped, so did the stars we thought we saw. Maybe the constellations of the phantom age are the purest kind of illusion. Real to those who needed wonder, invisible to those who required proof. And yet, something in us still remembers. When you step outside on a cloudless night and look up, do you not sometimes sense that there should be more, that the sky feels thinner than it used to? The ancients said the stars were holes in the veil, glimpses of the divine fire beyond. If so, perhaps some of those holes were sewn shut when history was mended. The heavens were patched, and we forgot to notice the seam. But the silence of the phantom stars remains. It lives in the pause between one breath and another, in the tremor of recognition when a constellation seems slightly wrong. It waits in the archives of forgotten observatories and in the notebooks of those who still draw the night by hand. Brother Alaric's weeping crown is gone, yet sometimes, in the last hour before dawn, a faint shimmer appears above the horizon, so soft it could be mistake or mercy. No instrument records it, no chart admits it, only the heart recognizes its rhythm. And if you close your eyes, you may see it too. A crown of faint blue fire, bending over the sleeping world. Perhaps it is not gone, only resting in a slower sky. Perhaps the stars remember us better than we remember them. Perhaps the universe, too, keeps its own quiet chronicle of phantom time, and waits, patiently, for us to look up again. They said the abbey burned on a windless night, as if the fire had learned to breathe without air. The bells did not ring, the river did not rise, only a soft orange veil moved from roof to roof while the brothers carried what they could into the cloister. Chalice, relic, a single cradle of psalms. And when dawn came, the nave stood like a blackened ribcage against a pearled sky, and beneath it, under stone and soot and the faint, oceanic smell of soaked timber, there opened a stair that few had noticed before, steps powdered with cinder, leading to the library that had hidden its breath below ground. The door was oak char, silvered at the edges where heat had licked it clean, and the iron latch still held the memory of flame. Inside, the air was cool and metallic, the kind of cold that keeps secrets. Shelves had collapsed in slow spirals, but some alcoves endured, and in them lay codices whose leather had puckered into dark fruit. Here and there a thread of gilt on a spine winked like a star in damp night. It is known that fire can destroy and also preserve. Ashes seal, char protects, as in Herculaneum where papyri turned to carbon and yet remained, waiting for light to learn new ways to see. So too these books, embalmed in gray sleep, kept their quiet stories. When the brothers returned with lanterns, a thin smoke still braided the vaults, and the ground crunched with vitrified sand. They moved gently, as if walking on the ribs of time. A novice found the first volume, a small gospel bound in calf, its clasps fused into a single tear of metal. When at last they coaxed it open with warm linen and patience, a scent rose like rain on stone. The text was careful, the rubric a soft blood, but it was the colophon that stopped every breath in the room. Written in a hand unlike the main, a scribe declared the copying finished in the year of our Lord 982. And then, on the line below, the same hand had crossed itself and written again, in the year of our Lord 682, as if the clock had leaned both forward and back. Someone whispered that ink can flow when heat runs wild, numbers can blur, but the strokes were sure, the dates deliberate, the second not a correction but a mirror. The abbot set his palm upon the page as if blessing a fevered child and said only, "Keep reading." Farther in, among shelves bowed like old oars, lay a miscellany, homilies, computus tables, a calendar of moons. The Easter reckoning danced. The Paschal full moon listed twice in one spring. An eclipse noted where no annals beyond these walls remember darkness. A saint's feast drifting across months like a lost boat. A gloss in the margin, in a different ink, suggested the dates were aligned to the old count, meaning the Julian that wandered, awaiting Gregorian hands that would not arrive for centuries. A light factual anchor for the soul. Calendars do slip and builders set churches by sunrise that slowly migrates. Yet even with mercy given to lunar reluctance, something else moved here, an undertow, as if the library itself had kept a separate tide. In a chained bay, a lectern with iron loops still dreaming of their books, they found a palimpsest. Beneath a sermon on patience slept another text, revealed by raking light and breath. A travel note naming an emperor no coin confirms and a bridge consecrated in the year between. A phrase that returned like a refrain throughout the cellar. The torch glow trembled. Dust descended in spirals like prayers. They read until the lamps grew small. A cartulary boasted charters from 2 bishops whose years do not overlap except here. A bestiary showed a fish with a star for an eye and noted that it rose when 3 winters share one harvest. On a flyleaf, a weather record scratched by a lay brother spoke of snows in summer and a second dawn, echoing the monastery above where the sun had once, perhaps, hesitated. In a long drawer of flat treasures, a map lay salt-stained and shy, its coastline erased to softness, and in the corner a note by a careful oceanic hand. Here the world withdrew its face. The brothers looked at one another. The same phrase had been seen elsewhere, in other ages and other rooms. Some pattern, crumbled yet persistent, seemed to be threading them like beads on a string. Phantom years surfacing not as a declaration but as a breath upon glass. When word reached scholars across valleys and seas, they came with instruments and vows, to protect, to copy, to understand. They weighed the parchment, tasted the iron gall, counted the hair side and the flesh side, measured the ruling lines impressed by a stylus that had not touched a warm hand for half a millennium. Dendrochronology murmured 1 century for a cover board. Radiocarbon, another for the sewing thread. Paleography placed a confident finger on a date that the sky charts, if read sternly, would contradict. The library did not argue. It breathed, and in that breath one could feel the long compromise of remembering. How the scribes chose what to shelter, how they sometimes left a snow-smooth blank where a name might have invited fire, how the slow, sacred work of copying needed not only ink but mercy. Some pages near the heart of the cellar had been glazed by heat into translucent leaf. Through them, letters shone backward from the next page, as if the book itself had learned to look into its own past. Others bore tiny punctures where beetles once wrote their blind alphabets along the margins, and even these holes lined up into constellations if you held the sheet to the lamp just so. One night, while the rain spoke softly on the stones above, the abbot and a scholar from the coast opened a narrow volume with a leather like quiet thunder. It contained a simple list: births, deaths, an accounting of candles, a tally of barley lofted and emptied. Twice in its middle the list ran out of numbers and continued without them. Just names, just weather, just the breath of a place going on, as if the count had been gently set down to rest. Between those unnumbered folios, pressed flat and brown, lay a sprig of rosemary, now dust. Its scent rose faintly, star-marked and medicinal, and for a moment the room felt aligned with something larger than chronology. Perhaps, the scholar said, voice veiled. They lived those years, but the years refused to be counted. The abbot nodded as if blessing a thought. Some voices, he answered, only echo when we are ready to listen. At last they closed the door and let the cellar darken. The ash settled. The undercroft of books returned to its slow cathedral of damp and beetle hum. Above, masons would mend the ribs, glaziers would nurse light back into the eyes of saints, and bells, when metal and mercy allowed, would learn again to speak. But below, the library will keep its oceanic rhythm, cradling the contradictions like shells that still hold the sound of vanished tides. If you ask for verdicts, the ash will answer with cool fingers and the pages with a soft refusal. Perhaps it was never meant to be found, the double dates, the day between, the emperor whose name fogs the glass. Or perhaps it was meant to be found only like this, descending in quiet, touching with breath, leaving with nothing proven and everything gentled. When you climb back to night air, a soot moth will follow and vanish in moonlight. You will taste iron and rosemary and a word you will not remember upon waking. And as sleep draws near, the thought comes softly, like a hand closing a book. What burns is not always lost, and what is saved is not always sure, and sometimes the truest library lies beneath the ashes, breathing. They say the village lay half forgotten between two rivers that no longer remember their names, and at its center stood a church of gray stone, small and patient, with a bell tower that tilted slightly, as though bowing to a silence older than faith itself. No one knew who cast the bell. Its bronze was dark and rough to the touch, its rim marked with symbols that belonged to no language the parish could read. Some said it had been brought from the ruins of an older monastery. Others whispered it had fallen from the sky, a star cooled into metal. Whatever its origin, the bell's voice was unlike any other. When it rang, the air seemed to thicken. Sound turned liquid, and the world held its breath. It was said that the bell did not mark hours, it summoned them. Each toll felt like time itself folding inward, a pulse remembered rather than lived. One winter, the bell rang at dawn though no hand had touched its rope. The villagers gathered beneath the tower, breath clouding in the cold, listening to the slow rhythm of the sound. 7 tolls, no more, no less, and then silence, deep enough to hear snow falling. At first, they thought it was an omen, but nothing followed. No plague, no birth, no war. Just the soft persistence of ordinary life. Still, the villagers could not shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the air itself carried a new rhythm. The old calendar said it was the year 1209. Yet when merchants came from the coast, their ledgers spoke of 1206. For a while, the village lived 3 years ahead of its neighbors, and no one could explain why. At night, the priest, a quiet man with tired eyes, searched the archives in the sacristy. The church records agreed with neither calendar. Births and burials crossed one another, children appearing in ink before their parents were wed, winters repeating twice in the same decade. The ink remembers differently, he murmured. Beneath his lamp he found an entry written in an older hand. The bell first spoke in the year between. He traced the words with his thumb, and for a moment he thought he could hear the bell humming behind the walls. That night, he dreamed of standing on the tower roof under a sky too large to belong to the world. The stars were silent, but in their silence was music. Days became weeks, weeks became seasons. The villagers continued to hear the bell at strange hours. sometimes at noon when clouds covered the sun, sometimes in the blue hush before dawn. The sound came from nowhere and everywhere, as if it echoed through centuries stacked like sheets of glass. Once, a traveler passing through stopped and wept when he heard it. "I know this sound," he said, "but not from this life." He left before anyone could ask more. Another time, a child claimed that when the bell rang, she saw figures walking between the trees. Men in robes, women carrying candles, faces soft as smoke. "They looked like us," she whispered, "but older and lighter like breath." The villagers said nothing. In a place where the sky itself had forgotten the proper year, such visions were not miracles. They were simply part of the air. When the priest grew old, he wrote a new chronicle, careful and slow, but the pages did not behave. The ink faded faster than it should, leaving ghostly traces of letters that glowed when moonlight touched them. In the margin of his last entry, he wrote, "Perhaps time has its own bells, and we have mistaken their ringing for ours." The next morning he was gone. The door stood open, the snow unbroken except for a single circle around the tower base, as though something vast had descended and risen again. Centuries later, when travelers rediscovered the valley, they found the church still standing, though the village around it had long dissolved back into the fields. The bell hung where it always had, its clapper stilled by rust, its cymbals worn smooth by weather. They say if you touch its rim, it feels warm, as if it still remembers the last sound it made. On certain nights, windless, breathless, the valley fills with a tone too low to be heard and too deep to ignore. Dogs lift their heads. Windows tremble. The heart answers. Some claim it is the wind. Others, the earth turning in its sleep. But those who linger long enough understand. It is the bell calling through the centuries it was denied, summoning time itself to remember what it forgot. If you stand there at dusk, between the two nameless rivers, the fields glow faintly as though lit from within. You may feel that something vast and kind is listening, that the world, weary of being measured, has chosen to breathe again. And when the unseen bell tolls its single note, you might sense the brief pause between one age and another, the hush where years touch without speaking. That moment will pass, but its echo will follow you into sleep. For even silence has its memory, and not all bells belong to time. Some are meant to ring in no century at all, only in the heart that still believes the past can be forgiven by sound. It was found in a cell no larger than a prayer, a narrow room behind the apse of a ruined monastery, where wind and silence had long shared the same language. On a table made from the lid of a coffin, a single candle still stood. Its wax was yellowed, its wick unburned for centuries, yet the faintest scent of smoke lingered, like breath caught between worlds. The monks who had once lived here were gone, their names scattered across the wind, their books turned to silence, but this candle remained, an ember of intention, patient as stone. They said it had never gone out, not entirely. That even through the dark centuries when the abbey fell and rose again, someone, somewhere, kept its flame alive. It was not a candle of devotion, nor of ritual. It was a candle of memory. Its legend began in the forgotten heart of what scholars would later call the Dark Age. An age that might never have been. The story tells of Brother Theophilus, who was neither scribe nor scholar, but keeper of light. His task was simple: to tend the lamps that burned before the relics and to relight them from a central flame kept in the library at the hour of matins. That flame, he was told, had been brought from the Holy Land by a pilgrim who swore it had never died since the time of Constantine. Whether truth or symbol, Theophilus treated it as a living creature. Each night, as frost glazed the cloister, he would kneel beside the candle's trembling light and whisper the hours aloud, not to mark time, but to keep it awake. Then, one winter unlike any other, a silence fell so deep that even the bells hesitated. The chronicle says nothing of war or plague, only that the days grew shorter and the sun ceased to rise in its appointed place. Theophilus, alone in the scriptorium, noticed that the light reached the wall too soon, then not at all. Shadows lengthened before dawn, and by Compline, darkness felt eternal. "The world has misplaced its morning," he wrote, and yet the candle burned as before, calm, unwavering, as if defying the logic of the heavens. When the brothers fled the abbey for fear of famine, Theophilus remained behind. He said he would keep the flame until the sun returned. None ever saw him again. Centuries later, when the ruins were cleared, the candle was discovered in the same place. Burned halfway down, the wick curled like a sleeping serpent. The scholars who examined it were puzzled. Its wax, they said, belonged to no known blend. It melted at neither the right heat nor the wrong one. Some claimed the air in the cell was too still for decay. Others suggested that time itself had thinned here, slowed to the pace of breath. The candle seemed to resist measurement. Its base dated to 1 century, its soot to another. One historian, tracing the carbon marks, whispered that it might have burned across centuries no one had lived. The missing years, caught in wax. And so, it became a relic of paradox, a slow flame that outlasted the age that invented it. Pilgrims began to visit the monastery ruins, not for miracles, but for silence. They said that standing before the candle felt like standing before time itself, warm, indifferent, alive. When the light touched their faces, memories not their own came unbidden. A child's laughter in a vanished courtyard, the toll of bells across a city no map recalled, the scent of ink in a scriptorium lost to ash. The monks who later rebuilt the abbey refused to relight the candle. They feared that whatever fire had burned there belonged to another order of truth, one that human hands could not repeat. Instead, they left it unlit but watched, and even unlit it seemed to glow faintly, as though memory itself had learned to shine without flame. Now it rests in a small glass case, its surface cracked like old skin, its core the color of dusk. Tourists pass, scholars debate, candles flicker and die. Yet sometimes, rarely, a visitor reports seeing the faint shimmer of light within the wax, not flame but reflection, as though the candle were remembering its own fire. Scientists speak of phosphorescence, of oil trapped and reacting with air. But in the hush of that cell, explanations feel like stones thrown into deep water. What returns is not certainty, but echo. The monks left behind a single inscription carved into the lintel above the door. Lux meminit, the light remembers. No one knows who wrote it. Perhaps Theophilus himself before his final vigil. Perhaps another who found the room long after, and felt the pulse of something that should not still exist. The words endure, and so does the candle. When the moon crosses the narrow window just right, the glass case catches its silver and sends it across the room. A thin thread of light bridging centuries of silence. For a heartbeat, it seems the world aligns again. Time untwisting, history remembering the rhythm it once forgot. Some say the candle will burn again when the age is ready, when the missing centuries reclaim their breath. Others believe it never stopped, that somewhere beyond sight, in the hush between days, the flame still trembles, unseen but unbroken, warming the dark that lingers behind all our calendars. And perhaps that is enough, not to see, not to prove, but to know that something endures where logic cannot reach. For even if the candle has burned through time, it has done so gently, without ambition, without smoke. It has kept its promise, to light the darkness, not to end it. And as night gathers around your own quiet room, you may feel its reflection. A soft warmth at the edge of your thought. A whisper reminding you that what is forgotten is never entirely gone. The flame that began in silence continues there still, waiting not to be witnessed, but to be believed. The night ends where all things forgotten begin, in silence so patient it feels like mercy. Somewhere between centuries, time loosens its grip, and the stories you have heard drift together like dust over an ancient floor. The clock that forgot to turn, the emperor who never was, the scribes who erased by blessing, the map that erased itself, the cathedral that kept the wrong sky, the stars that lied so gently we called it faith, the library that hid its breath beneath ashes, the bells that rang in no century, the candle that burned through time. Each one, a small light carried across the gulf of uncounted years, each one whispering the same secret, that history is not a line but a breath. The chronicles say there was a gap, an emptiness between empires, a wound in time where no events were written. But perhaps it was not emptiness at all. Perhaps it was a kindness, a pause, a space where the world exhaled and began again. If you close your eyes now, you might see it. Not an age of darkness, but of waiting. 1,000 quiet gestures that went unwritten. A monk mending a shoe beside the fire. A woman pressing herbs into cloth. A child tracing the shadow of a bird across a wall that no longer stands. The centuries we call lost are filled with such small lights. Too soft for chronicles, too human for marble. And maybe that is why they vanished. Because they did not seek to endure, only to live. The empires rose and fell. Their banners turned to dust. But the breath of those forgotten hearts still moves through the pages, steady as a heartbeat beneath the ink. Historians will argue for centuries more, about calendars and emperors, carbon dates and missing years. But beneath their words lies another kind of truth, older and quieter. It lives in the way a candle flickers when no wind moves, in the way a bell sometimes rings without reason, in the feeling that time itself might be a dream we agreed to share. The phantom centuries may never yield proof, because proof belongs to the waking world, and these stories belong to the hour between waking and sleep. They are not explanations, but invitations. To listen, not to learn. To remember, not to prove. Perhaps that was the real cover-up. Not a conspiracy of kings, but of silence itself. A silence that chose to shelter what was too tender to survive the noise of record. The scribes knew it. The masons knew it. Even the stars knew it, when they dimmed for 100 winters to let the world rest. And now, after so many nights, we have wandered through that quiet age, following the glow of old candles and the echo of bells that ring beyond time. You have walked the halls of forgotten cathedrals and breathed the dust of vanished libraries. You have looked into skies that remember differently. And still you are here, awake at the edge of dream, listening to the hush that history left behind. In this silence, the world begins again. The forgotten years breathe once more. Slow, grateful, endless. And you, too, are part of their memory now. For everything that is remembered is reborn, and everything that is forgotten waits gently to be named again. The bell no longer rings, the map no longer shows the way, the candle no longer burns, and yet, they do. They endure in the only place time cannot reach. The mind that imagines, the heart that forgives, the breath that listens. And so the age that never happened becomes the age that never ended. Its light lingers, faint, forgiving, eternal, in the small hours when the body drifts and the soul begins to wander. The candle still glows, the bells still hum, the ink still dries on pages that no one will ever find. It is not a story to solve, but a story to rest inside. Now the hour grows late. Let the night fold you into its quiet. The centuries will keep their watch. The lost will stay luminous. And the world, patient, fragile, faithful, will turn once more beneath the slow and merciful stars.